Hello, I'm Karen. I'm 64 years old, and I never believed much in premonitions. I've always been a practical woman, down to earth, someone who trusts facts and logic more than feelings or hunches. I was a nurse for over 40 years. You can't survive in that profession if you let emotions cloud your judgment. You need to be rational, methodical, precise. That's who I've always been. But that day, something inside me screamed so loud that I couldn't ignore it. And that scream, that inexplicable feeling saved my life and my husband's life in ways I could never have imagined. It was a Saturday morning in late September, one of those perfect autumn days when the air is crisp and clean, and the leaves are just beginning to turn gold and crimson. The sun was shining brightly, not a cloud in the sky. It was the kind of morning that makes you grateful to be alive, grateful for the simple beauty of the world around you. My husband, Thomas, was behind the wheel of our Ford F-150 pickup truck, the same truck we'd had for almost 10 years now. It was reliable, comfortable, and had taken us on countless trips over the years. Thomas is 66, a retired construction supervisor with hands that still bear the calluses of decades of hard work. He's a quiet man, steady and dependable, the kind of person you can always count on in a crisis. We were driving down Highway 89, heading toward the small town of Pineville, where our friends, Margaret and Robert Carter, lived. The Carters had been our friends for over 20 years. We'd met them at a church picnic back when our kids were still in school, and we'd stayed close ever since. Margaret was a retired teacher, Robert a former bank manager. They were good people, the kind of friends who feel like family. We hadn't seen them in months, and this trip was something we'd been looking forward to. It was about a 3-hour drive from our home in Riverside, and we'd planned to spend the weekend with them. Margaret had promised to make her famous pot roast, and Robert wanted to show Thomas his new workshop in the garage. Simple pleasures, but important ones at our age. The radio was playing softly, some oldies station that Thomas liked. We were talking about trivial things as couples do on long drives. Thomas mentioned that he wanted to stop at the hardware store on Monday to pick up some supplies for a project he was working on in our backyard. He'd decided to build raised garden beds for me so I could grow vegetables without having to bend down so much. My knees weren't what they used to be, and he'd noticed how I winced sometimes when I was weeding. I was telling him about a recipe I'd seen in a magazine, something with butternut squash that I wanted to try. We talked about whether we should get new curtains for the living room. The old ones were looking faded. We discussed calling Laura, our daughter, later that evening to see how the kids were doing in school. Normal conversation. Ordinary life. Everything was exactly as it should be. We'd been on the road for about an hour and 15 minutes. I remember looking at the clock on the dashboard. 10:47 a.m. I remember because of what happened next. Without warning, without any logical reason, I felt it. It started as a cold sensation at the base of my skull, like someone had placed an ice cube against my neck. The cold spread quickly, racing down my spine in a wave that made me gasp. My stomach clenched painfully, and my heart began to pound so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands, which had been resting calmly in my lap, suddenly went ice cold and started to tremble. But it wasn't just physical. There was something else, something harder to describe. It was a certainty, absolute and undeniable, that we were in danger, that if we kept driving, something terrible, something fatal, was going to happen. I've never experienced anything like it before or since. It was overwhelming, terrifying, impossible to ignore. I turned to look at Thomas, and I must have looked as frightened as I felt because his expression immediately changed from relaxed contentment to concern. "Turn the car around," I said. My voice came out strained, almost strangled. "Turn the car around now." Thomas glanced at me, his brow furrowing. "What? Karen, what's wrong?" "I don't know," I said, and I could hear the panic in my own voice. "I don't know, but we need to go back. Right now. Please, Thomas. Please." Now, Thomas and I have been married for 42 years. In that time, we've been through a lot together. We've raised 2 children, survived financial hardships, dealt with sick parents, weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. We know each other better than we know ourselves sometimes, and Thomas knows me well enough to know that I don't panic easily. I don't make demands without reason. If I'm scared, there's usually a good reason for it. So even though I could see the confusion in his eyes, even though this made no logical sense, even though we were on a straight, safe highway on a beautiful day with nothing at all wrong as far as he could see, he didn't argue with me. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell me I was being silly. He didn't try to calm me down or convince me everything was fine. He simply said, "Okay." He slowed down, checked his mirrors, and carefully pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway. Cars whizzed past us, and I felt each one like a physical threat, even though rationally I knew they were just other people going about their business. Thomas waited for a gap in the traffic, then made a careful U-turn and started driving back the way we'd come. The moment we turned around, the feeling began to ease. Not completely. I was still shaking, still cold, still frightened, but the overwhelming sense of imminent danger started to recede. It was like stepping back from the edge of a cliff you hadn't even realized you were standing on. "You want to tell me what that was about?" Thomas asked, gently as we drove. He wasn't angry or annoyed, just concerned. "I don't know," I admitted, and it was the truth. I felt something. Something bad was going to happen if we kept going. I can't explain it better than that. Thomas reached over and took my hand. His palm was warm against my cold fingers. "Your instincts have never been wrong, Karen. Not in all the years I've known you. If you felt something was wrong, then something was wrong." I wanted to believe him, but I also felt foolish. What if it was nothing? What if I'd just had a panic attack or something? We'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Margaret and Robert would be disappointed, and what was I going to tell them? "Sorry we couldn't make it. I had a bad feeling." Thomas must have sensed what I was thinking because he squeezed my hand. "Don't worry about the Carters. I'll call them when we get home and explain." "Well, I'll tell them you weren't feeling well. They'll understand. We can reschedule." I nodded, grateful for his support, even as I felt guilty about ruining our weekend plans. Thomas picked up his cell phone from the cup holder and, keeping one hand on the wheel, speed-dialed Robert's number. I could hear it ringing over the truck's speaker system. "Hello?" Robert's voice came through, cheerful and expectant. "Hey, Robert. It's Thomas. Listen, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to reschedule this weekend." "Oh no. Is everything okay?" The concern in Robert's voice was immediate. "Karen's not feeling well. We're heading back home." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." "Nothing serious, I hope." No, just, we're not as young as we used to be." Thomas forced a laugh. "We'll call you next week and set up another time." Of course. You take care of Karen, and tell her Margaret and I send our love." "Will do." "Thanks for understanding, Robert." "Anytime, friend. Drive safe." Thomas ended the call and glanced at me. "See? No problem. They understand." But I barely heard him. My mind was racing, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to figure out why I'd felt such overwhelming terror, trying to rationalize the irrational. The drive home took another hour and 15 minutes. Thomas kept stealing worried glances at me, but I stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape roll by, lost in my thoughts. By the time we pulled into our driveway, it was just after noon. Our house looked exactly as we'd left it 2 hours earlier. A modest single-story ranch-style home with cream-colored siding and dark green shutters. The lawn was neatly mowed. The flower beds I'd planted in the spring were still blooming with late-season roses and chrysanthemums. Everything was peaceful, normal, undisturbed. Thomas helped me out of the truck, his hand steady on my elbow. "Come on, let's get you inside and settled." We walked up the front path, and Thomas unlocked the door. The house smelled like the cinnamon candle I'd been burning that morning before we left. The living room was tidy, sunlight streaming through the windows and making patterns on the hardwood floor. Our cat, Whiskers, came trotting over to greet us, meowing indignantly at having been left alone. Everything was exactly as it should be. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Thomas led me to the couch and sat me down gently. "You want some tea? Water? Maybe you should lie down for a bit." "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. "Really, Thomas, I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me." He sat down beside me and pulled me close, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "Don't apologize. If you felt something, you felt something. I'd rather turn around 100 times for nothing than ignore you once and have something bad happen." I leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. We sat like that for a long time, just holding each other, neither of us speaking. Outside, the day continued its perfect progression. Birds sang in the trees. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. The mailman drove by in his little white truck. Life went on, normal and ordinary. But inside me, that sense of unease remained, coiled tight like a spring waiting to release. I didn't know it then, but my premonition had saved our lives. If we had continued on that road, if Thomas had dismissed my fears or convinced me to push through the anxiety, we would never have made it to the Carter's house. We would have died on that highway. And the person responsible for our deaths was someone I never would have suspected in a million years. Someone I loved with all my heart. Someone I had given life to. My own son. The rest of that Saturday passed in a strange, surreal fog. I tried to busy myself with mundane tasks, Anything to take my mind off the inexplicable panic I'd felt on the highway. I folded laundry that didn't really need folding, reorganized the spice cabinet that was already organized, watered plants that didn't need watering. Thomas watched me with worried eyes but didn't push me to talk. He knows me well enough to know that I'll talk when I'm ready, and pressuring me only makes me retreat further into myself. Around 3 in the afternoon, I finally settled down with a book, curling up in my favorite armchair by the window, but I couldn't focus on the words. My eyes scanned the same paragraph over and over without comprehending any of it. Thomas came in from the garage where he'd been puttering around with some tools. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at me. "I'm going to make us an early dinner. How does chicken soup sound?" "That sounds good," I said, even though I wasn't hungry at all. He disappeared into the kitchen, and soon I could hear the comforting sounds of him cooking, the refrigerator opening and closing, the knife on the cutting board, water running in the sink, normal sounds, safe sounds. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, Thomas was gently shaking my shoulder. "Karen, honey, wake up. Dinner's ready." I blinked, disoriented for a moment, then focused on his face. I fell asleep. "You needed it. Come on, let's eat while it's hot." We ate at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals over the decades. The soup was good. Thomas had always been a better cook than he gave himself credit for, and I managed to eat about half a bowl before my stomach rebelled. "I'm sorry," I said, pushing the bowl away. "It's delicious. I'm just not very hungry." "That's okay. You want to talk about what happened today?" I looked at him, at his kind, weathered face, at the concern in his eyes. I wish I could explain it. I really do, but I can't. It was just this overwhelming feeling, like every instinct I have was screaming at me that we were in danger. "Do you think it's gone now? The feeling?" I considered that. "Mostly. I still feel unsettled, but not like before. Not that terror." Thomas nodded slowly. "Well, whatever it was, I'm glad you told me. I'd rather be safe than sorry." We cleaned up the dinner dishes together, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of long marriage. Then we settled in the living room to watch television, though neither of us really paid attention to what was on. Around 9 o'clock, the phone rang. Thomas answered it. "Oh, hey, Laura. No, we're both here. Your mom wasn't feeling well, so we turned around and came home. Yeah, she's fine now. Hang on, I'll put her on." He handed me the phone. Our daughter Laura's voice came through, warm with concern. "Mom, Dad said you weren't feeling well. What's wrong?" "I'm fine, sweetie. Really, just had a weird spell while we were driving. Nothing to worry about." "Are you sure? Do you need me to come down? I can get Mark to watch the kids and drive down tomorrow." No, don't do that. I promise I'm fine." "How are Emma and Jack?" Laura launched into an update about her kids. Emma had won a spelling bee at school. Jack had scored his first goal in soccer. I listened, letting her cheerful chatter wash over me, grounding me back in the normal, everyday world. We talked for about 20 minutes before saying goodbye. After I hung up, I felt better, more like myself. "Laura okay?" Thomas asked. "She's good. The kids are good. Everything's normal in Oregon." "Good," Thomas said. "That's good." We went to bed around 10:30. I lay in the dark next to Thomas, listening to his breathing gradually slow and deepen as he fell asleep. But sleep eluded me. I stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from the tree outside our window move across it as a breeze rustled the leaves. What had I felt on that highway? Was it genuine intuition? Some kind of sixth sense warning me of danger? Or was it just anxiety, stress, maybe the beginning of some kind of health problem? I didn't know. But lying there in the dark, with Thomas sleeping peacefully beside me, and our house quiet and safe around us, I made myself a promise. If I ever felt something like that again, I would trust it completely. I wouldn't second-guess myself. I wouldn't rationalize it away, because something deep inside me, some instinct I couldn't explain or justify, told me that feeling had been real, that the danger had been real, and that I wasn't done with it yet. Sunday dawned bright and clear. Another beautiful autumn day. Thomas and I went to church as we always did on Sunday mornings. First Baptist had been our church home for over 30 years. We knew everyone, and everyone knew us. Several people asked about our canceled trip, and I gave vague answers about not feeling well. Mary Henderson, who sang in the choir, squeezed my hand and said, "You take care of yourself, Karen. We're not getting any younger, you know." I smiled and agreed, though her words struck me oddly. We're not getting any younger. It was true, of course. Thomas and I were in our mid-60s. We had more years behind us than ahead of us. But we were healthy, active, vital. We had plans. We had dreams. We weren't ready to slow down, to fade away, to become invisible old people waiting around to die. After church, we went to lunch at Henderson's Diner, our favorite local restaurant. The place had been there for 40 years, and it hadn't changed much in that time. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor, a jukebox in the corner that still worked. Doris, the owner, greeted us warmly. "The usual?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Please," Thomas said. We had the same thing every Sunday. Thomas ordered the pot roast. I ordered the chicken salad sandwich. We split a piece of apple pie for dessert. Routine, comfortable, safe. As we ate, I found myself watching Thomas. Really watching him, in a way I hadn't done in years. He was still handsome to me, even with the gray hair and the wrinkles around his eyes. He was solid, dependable, good. We'd built a life together. A good life. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, catching me staring. "Just that I love you," I said simply. He smiled. That gentle smile that had made me fall in love with him 43 years ago. "I love you too, Karen. Always have. Always will." We finished our lunch and drove home, and the rest of Sunday passed quietly. We worked in the garden together, Thomas trimming bushes while I deadheaded the roses. We read the newspaper on the porch. We made sandwiches for dinner and watched a nature documentary on television. It was peaceful, ordinary, normal. And yet, underneath it all, that feeling of unease persisted, like a low hum in the background that I couldn't quite tune out. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I paused in front of the mirror in our bathroom. I looked at my reflection, at the lines on my face, at the gray in my hair, at the slight sag of age in my jaw and neck. When had I gotten old? When had that young nurse, full of energy and ambition, turned into this woman staring back at me? I wasn't unhappy with what I saw. I'd earned every line, every gray hair. They were marks of a life lived, of experiences had, of love given and received. But looking at myself, I felt a strange sense of urgency, a feeling that time was running out, that something was coming, and I needed to be ready for it. I didn't know then how right I was. Monday morning, Thomas left early to go to the hardware store. He was excited about his garden bed project and wanted to get started on it. I kissed him goodbye at the door and watched him drive away in his truck, feeling an irrational flutter of anxiety as he disappeared down the street. I shook it off and went back inside. The house felt too quiet, too empty. I decided to bake. Baking has always been my therapy, my way of working through difficult emotions. I pulled out my mother's old recipe box, worn and stained from decades of use. My mother had been dead for 15 years now, but these recipes kept her alive in my memory. Her handwriting on the cards, the little notes she'd made, add extra vanilla or don't overbake, made me feel close to her. I decided to make her sugar cookies, the same ones I used to make for Brian and Laura when they were children. As I measured out flour and sugar, creamed butter and eggs, I found myself thinking about my kids. Laura, my youngest, had always been easy. She'd been a cheerful baby, a cooperative toddler, a responsible teenager. She'd done well in school, gone to college, married a good man, had beautiful children. She lived in Oregon now, about 8 hours away, but we talked on the phone at least twice a week. She was happy, stable, content with her life. Brian had always been different. I loved him. Of course I loved him. He was my firstborn, my baby boy. But from early on, he'd been difficult. As a child, he'd been prone to tantrums, to outbursts of anger that seemed disproportionate to whatever had triggered them. He'd been jealous of Laura, resentful of the attention she got. I'd tried to be fair, to love them equally, but Brian always felt like he was getting less somehow. As a teenager, he'd gotten into trouble. Nothing too serious. Shoplifting once, caught drinking at a party, suspended from school for fighting. Each time, Thomas and I had talked to him, punished him, tried to set him on the right path, and each time, he'd promised to do better, to be better. But the promises never lasted long. As an adult, Brian had struggled to hold down jobs. He always had excuses. The boss was unfair, his coworkers were lazy. He wasn't getting the recognition he deserved. He'd drifted from one position to another, never staying anywhere for more than a year or two. Thomas and I had helped him financially more times than I could count. We'd paid his rent when he was short, bought him a car when his old one died, lent him money that was never repaid. We told ourselves we were helping him, that he just needed time to find his way. But deep down, I'd always known the truth. Brian had a sense of entitlement. He believed the world owed him something. He wanted the rewards without putting in the work. 3 years ago, he'd married Jennifer. We'd been hopeful. Jennifer seemed like a good influence. Sweet, hardworking, responsible. She had a steady job as an administrative assistant at an accounting firm. She seemed to calm Brian down, to ground him. For a while, things seemed better. Brian got a job at a logistics company and actually kept it for more than a year. He and Jennifer bought a small house. They talked about starting a family. We allowed ourselves to hope that maybe, finally, Brian had grown up. But over the past year, I'd started noticing things. Small things that didn't quite add up. Brian had become very interested in our finances. He'd ask questions about our retirement savings, about our investments, about our will. At first, I'd thought he was just being practical, thinking about his own financial future. But the questions had become more frequent, more specific, more calculating. 6 months ago, he'd come to dinner and asked point blank, "Mom, Dad, have you thought about how you're going to divide the inheritance?" The question had caught me completely off guard. Thomas and I exchanged a look of confusion. "Brian, we just retired," I'd said, trying to keep my tone light. "We're not planning on dying anytime soon." He'd laughed, but there had been something off about it, something that didn't reach his eyes. I know. I just mean, it's good to have these things planned out, legally, so there's no confusion later." Thomas had changed the subject, but the question had bothered me for days afterward. Why was Brian thinking about our deaths? Why was he so concerned about inheritance? We weren't wealthy, but we'd saved carefully over decades. We had about $800,000 in various retirement accounts and investments. It was enough to live comfortably on for the rest of our lives, to travel a bit, maybe help out the grandkids with college someday. But to Brian, I realized with growing discomfort, it probably seemed like a fortune. In the weeks and months following that dinner, Brian had started coming around more often. He'd show up unannounced, always with some excuse. Wanted to borrow a tool, wanted to have coffee, wanted to help Thomas with yard work. But I'd notice him watching us, studying us. And sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, going through papers on Thomas's desk, or asking casual questions about our daily routines. "What time do you usually go to bed? Do you lock all the doors at night? What route do you take when you drive to Laura's?" At the time, I'd told myself he was just being a concerned son, that he worried about us getting older, becoming more vulnerable. But now, standing in my kitchen on Monday morning, mixing cookie dough and thinking about everything that had happened, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. What if Brian's interest hadn't been concern? What if it had been something else entirely? I pushed the thought away. I was being paranoid. Brian had his faults. Yes, but he was my son. He would never hurt us, would he? I shaped the cookie dough into balls and placed them on baking sheets, then slid them into the oven. As I was cleaning up, the doorbell rang. I glanced at the clock. 10:30 a.m. Who could that be? I dried my hands and went to the front door, looking through the peephole. It was Jennifer, and she looked terrified. I opened the door quickly, and Jennifer practically fell into my arms. She was trembling, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Jennifer! My God, what's wrong? Come in, come in!" I pulled her inside and shut the door, guiding her to the living room couch. She was shaking so hard I could feel it when I put my arm around her shoulders. "Karen!" she gasped, her voice hoarse. "Karen, I need to tell you something. Something terrible." My heart started pounding. "What is it? Are you hurt? Is someone hurt?" She shook her head violently. No, it's not. She broke down into sobs, unable to continue. I held her, making soothing sounds, rubbing her back the way I used to do with my children when they were upset. "It's okay. Whatever it is, you can tell me. You're safe here." After a few minutes, her sobs began to subside. I got up and went to the kitchen, grabbed a box of tissues and a glass of water, and brought them back to her. She drank deeply, her hands shaking so badly that water slopped over the rim. "Take your time," I told her. "I'm not going anywhere." She set the glass down and twisted the tissue in her hands, not looking at me. "I don't know how to say this. I've been trying to work up the courage for weeks now. I've barely been able to eat. Can't sleep. Brian doesn't know I'm here. He thinks I'm at work." A cold feeling was starting to settle in my stomach. "Jennifer, you're scaring me. What's going on?" She finally looked up at me, and the agony in her eyes made my breath catch. "It's Brian," she whispered. "He's planning something. Something horrible against you and Thomas." The room seemed to tilt. "What? What do you mean?" "He wants your money. The retirement money. He's been obsessed with it for months. He talks about it constantly. About how you don't need it. About how you're old and won't live that much longer anyway. About how it's wasted on you." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Jennifer, are you sure? Maybe you misunderstood." I didn't misunderstand. Her voice was flat now. Dead. "He told me his plan 2 weeks ago. He sat me down and told me exactly what he was going to do." "What plan?" I could barely get the words out. Jennifer took a shuddering breath. "He was going to have you killed. You and Thomas both. Make it look like an accident. You were supposed to go on that trip this past weekend, and something was going to happen on the road, a crash. He'd hired someone to run you off the highway, make it look like a tragic accident. Then, as your son, he would inherit everything. The world stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what I was hearing. My son, my Brian, the baby I'd carried for 9 months, the child I'd nursed and rocked and sang to sleep, the boy I'd bandaged scraped knees for, helped with homework, cheered for at Little League games. That boy had planned to murder us. No, I heard myself say. No, that's not. He wouldn't. But even as I said it, I knew it was true. I knew it with absolute certainty. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The questions about our routines, the interest in our finances, the way he'd asked about our trip plans, when we were leaving, what route we were taking, and my premonition on Saturday morning, that overwhelming terror that had made me beg Thomas to turn the car around. We would have died. If we'd kept driving, if we'd ignored that feeling, Brian's hired killer would have run us off the road, and we would have died. Oh God, I whispered. Oh my God. Jennifer was crying again. I'm so sorry, Karen. I should have told you sooner, but I was terrified. Brian said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I went down with him. He said he'd tell the police it was my idea, that I'd be charged as an accessory, and I believed him. I was so scared. I grabbed her hands, forcing her to look at me. But you're telling me now. Why now? Because I couldn't live with it anymore, she sobbed. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I looked at you, every time you smiled at me or hugged me or treated me like family, I felt like I was going to die inside. You've been nothing but good to me since the day Brian introduced us. You welcomed me into your family without hesitation. You've been more of a mother to me than my own mother ever was. And I was going to let him kill you. She collapsed against me, and I held her while she cried. My mind was racing, trying to process everything, trying to figure out what to do. Thomas. I needed Thomas. I pulled out my cell phone and called him. He answered on the second ring. Hey, honey, I'm just loading up the lumber. Should be home in about... Thomas, you need to come home. Now, right now. The urgency in my voice must have been clear because he didn't question it. I'm on my way. 5 minutes. I hung up and looked at Jennifer. You're going to tell Thomas everything you just told me. And then we're going to the police. Her eyes went wide with fear. The police? Karen, he's your son. Are you sure you want to? He tried to have us killed, I said, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. Hard, cold, certain. He's not getting away with that. I don't care if he's my son. True to his word, Thomas was home in 5 minutes. He came through the door, took one look at Jennifer's tear-stained face and my grim expression, and said, "What happened?" "Sit down," I told him. "You need to hear this." Jennifer told her story again, haltingly, with many tears and pauses. Thomas sat perfectly still, his face growing paler with each word. When she finished, there was a long, terrible silence. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Is there proof? Besides your word?" Jennifer nodded. "He has a notebook. He keeps it in his car, hidden in the trunk under the spare tire. He writes everything in it. Your schedules, your routines, the plan, and there's a name. The man he hired. His name is Kyle Brennan." Thomas looked at me. I looked back at him. In that moment, we didn't need words. After 42 years of marriage, we could communicate volumes with just a look. Our son had tried to have us murdered, and we were going to make sure he paid for it. "Get your purse," Thomas said to me, standing up. "Jennifer, you're coming with us. We're going to the police station right now." The drive to the police station took 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Jennifer sat in the back seat, crying quietly. Thomas drove with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. I stared straight ahead, feeling numb, disconnected from reality. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to people like us. We were ordinary people. We went to church on Sundays and paid our taxes and were kind to our neighbors. We didn't have drama. We didn't have crime in our family, except now we did. The police station was a low brick building on the edge of downtown. We parked in the visitor's lot and walked in through the front doors. The inside was institutional. Fluorescent lights, tile floors, the smell of coffee and cleaning products. A young officer sat at the front desk. He looked up as we approached. "Can I help you?" Thomas spoke, his voice steady despite everything. "We need to report a crime. An attempted murder." The officer's expression changed immediately from bored to alert. "Let me get someone for you. Have a seat." We sat on hard plastic chairs in the waiting area. The minutes ticked by. I watched people coming and going. Officers in uniform, civilians checking in, someone being let out in handcuffs. The mundane machinery of law enforcement, suddenly very real and relevant to my life. Finally, A detective emerged from a back hallway. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a rumpled suit and tie, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Detective Mark Harrison," he said, extending his hand to each of us in turn. "Officer Williams said something about an attempted murder?" "Yes," Thomas said. It's our son. He planned to have us killed." Detective Harrison's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or interest. "Why don't you all come with me? We'll talk in an interview room where we have more privacy." He led us down a corridor and into a small room with a table and several chairs. There was a mirror on one wall, one-way glass, I assumed, and a camera mounted in the corner. The room was plain, functional, designed for serious conversations. We all sat down, Jennifer beside me, Thomas on my other side, Detective Harrison across the table from us. He pulled out a notepad and pen, then looked at each of us in turn. "All right," he said. "Start from the beginning and tell me everything." Jennifer spoke first. Her voice was shaky, but she was remarkably clear and detailed considering how upset she was. She told him about Brian's obsession with our money over the past 6 months, about how he'd become fixated on our retirement savings, talking about it constantly, calculating what it would be worth, what he could do with it. She told him about 2 weeks ago, when Brian had sat her down and laid out his entire plan, how he'd found someone, this Kyle Brennan, through a contact at his work, someone who, according to Brian, had done jobs like this before, how Brian had paid him $5,000 up front with another $15,000 promised after the job was done. She told him about the notebook where Brian kept everything written down. Our schedules, our routines, our habits, the routes we normally took when we traveled, the times we usually went to bed, when we woke up, when we went out. "He'd been watching you," Jennifer said, her voice breaking, "for months. Taking notes, planning. He knew you were going to visit friends this weekend. He knew what time you'd be leaving, what highway you'd be taking. He gave all that information to Kyle Brennan. The plan was to run you off the road in a remote stretch where there wouldn't be witnesses. Make it look like you lost control, went over an embankment. Just another tragic accident. Elderly couple on a road trip." Detective Harrison was writing quickly, his pen moving steadily across the notepad. When Jennifer paused, he looked up. "And you're absolutely certain about all of this? This isn't speculation or interpretation?" "I'm certain," Jennifer said firmly. "He told me everything, showed me the notebook. He was proud of how carefully he'd planned it. He said it was foolproof." "Why did he tell you?" the detective asked. "Why confide in you if he was planning something illegal?" Jennifer laughed bitterly. "Because he thought I'd go along with it. He thought once we had the money, I'd be happy. He kept talking about what we could do with $800,000. Buy a bigger house, new cars, take vacations. He was already spending it in his mind." "But you didn't agree." "Of course I didn't agree." Jennifer's voice rose. "These are his parents. They've never been anything but kind to me. I told him he was crazy, that I wanted no part of it. That's when he threatened me. Said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I went down too. Said he'd claim it was my idea, that he'd say I manipulated him into it." Detective Harrison nodded slowly, then turned to me and Thomas. "And you had no idea any of this was happening?" I spoke for the first time since entering the room. "We knew Brian had been asking questions about our finances. It made me uncomfortable, but I never thought he would." I couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas squeezed my hand. "We canceled our trip at the last minute," he said. "On Saturday morning, we were on the road heading to our friend's house when Karen had a feeling. A premonition, I guess you could call it. She was terrified. Said we needed to turn around immediately, so we did." Detective Harrison looked at me with interest. "A premonition?" I nodded, feeling foolish saying it out loud. I know how it sounds, but I felt something. Like every instinct I had was screaming that we were in danger. "I made Thomas turn the car around and come home, and that probably saved your lives," the detective said quietly. He looked back at Jennifer. "You said there's a notebook. Where is it exactly?" "In Brian's car. A black Honda Civic. It's in the trunk, hidden under the carpet beneath the spare tire. It's a small spiral notebook, blue cover. And you're willing to testify to everything you've told me? You understand that means testifying against your husband?" Jennifer didn't hesitate. "Yes, I'll do whatever it takes. I can't live with this anymore. I won't." Detective Harrison stood up. "All right. Wait here. I need to make some calls, get the process started for a search warrant. This is going to take a few hours. Can I get any of you anything? Coffee? Water?" We all declined. After he left, the three of us sat in silence. What was there to say? We were in a police station waiting for them to arrest my son, my firstborn child. The baby I'd held against my chest and promised to always protect and love. How had it come to this? Jennifer broke the silence. I'm so sorry, Karen. Thomas. I should have told you sooner. I should have. You told us in time, I interrupted. That's what matters. You saved our lives, Jennifer. But I waited so long. I was such a coward. No, Thomas said firmly. You were scared. That's not the same as being a coward. You risked everything to come here today. That took courage. Jennifer started crying again, and I pulled her close, letting her sob against my shoulder. This young woman who had been so terrified, so alone, carrying this awful secret for weeks. She must have been through hell. Time passed slowly. At one point, a different officer brought us bottles of water and some packaged crackers. I drank the water but couldn't eat. My stomach was churning too much. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably about 3 hours, Detective Harrison returned. We have the warrant. We're sending officers to your son's workplace now to pick him up and search his vehicle. We've also contacted Kyle Brennan. He has a record. Assault, extortion, couple of other things. We're bringing him in for questioning too. What happens now? Thomas asked. Now we wait. Once we have Brian in custody and we've searched his car, we'll know more. If we find the notebook Jennifer described, and it contains what she says it does, combined with her testimony, we'll have enough to charge him. What would the charges be? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Conspiracy to commit murder. Solicitation of murder. Depending on what we find, possibly more. These are serious charges, Mrs. Anderson. If convicted, your son could be looking at decades in prison. Decades in prison. My son. My Brian. I felt like I was going to be sick. We should go home, Thomas said. Detective, will you call us when you know something? Of course. I have your number. Go home. Try to rest. This is going to be a long process. We left the police station and drove home in silence. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It should have been beautiful, but I couldn't appreciate it. Everything felt gray and cold. At home, Thomas and I moved through the evening like zombies. Neither of us ate dinner. We sat on the couch, holding hands, staring at the television without really seeing it. At 8:47 p.m., the phone rang. Thomas answered it, putting it on speaker so I could hear. Mr. Anderson? This is Detective Harrison. We have your son in custody. I closed my eyes, feeling tears leak out from under my lids. We found the notebook exactly where Jennifer said it would be. It contains detailed information about your routines, your travel plans, everything she described. We also found text messages on your son's phone between him and Kyle Brennan discussing the plan. Brennan is claiming your son approached him, offered him money to cause a fatal accident. He's willing to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, so it's true, Thomas said, his voice hollow. All of it. I'm afraid so. Your son is being held without bail. The arraignment will be in a few days. I'm very sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson. I know this must be incredibly difficult. What did Brian say? I asked. When you arrested him, there was a pause. At first, he denied everything, said the notebook was just notes, that the texts were taken out of context. But when we told him Jennifer had come forward, when we showed him all the evidence, he broke down, started crying, said he never really would have gone through with it, that he was just fantasizing, that it got out of hand. But he paid this man money, Thomas said. That's not fantasy. No, sir, it's not. That's why he's being charged. After we hung up, I sat there staring at nothing. Thomas wrapped his arms around me, and I felt his body shaking. He was crying, silent tears running down his face. We cried together for a long time, for the son we'd lost, for the trust that had been shattered, for the family that would never be whole again. Eventually, exhausted, we went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay in the dark, my mind replaying every moment of Brian's childhood, searching for signs I'd missed, wondering where we'd gone wrong. But deep down, I knew the truth. We hadn't made Brian who he was. He'd made choices, bad choices, evil choices, and now he would have to face the consequences. The next 3 months were a blur of lawyers, court appearances, and media attention. Somehow, the story leaked to the press. Local man arrested for plot to murder parents for inheritance. And our quiet little lives were suddenly very public. Reporters camped out on our lawn. Our phone rang constantly. Neighbors we'd known for years suddenly avoided making eye contact when they saw us in public. Some people were sympathetic. Others seemed to blame us somehow, as if we'd raised Brian to be a monster. Laura flew in from Oregon the day after Brian's arrest. She was devastated, unable to comprehend how her brother could have done such a thing. She wanted to visit him in jail, to confront him, to demand answers. We tried to talk her out of it, but she was determined. She went alone. When she came back 2 hours later, Her face was blotchy from crying and her eyes were hollow. "He's not sorry," she said quietly. "He's angry. Angry at Jennifer for telling you. Angry at you and Dad for pressing charges. Angry at the police for arresting him, but not sorry for what he tried to do." "What did he say?" I asked. "He said you didn't need all that money, that you were old and it was wasted on you, that he deserved it because he was young and could actually enjoy it. He said he was just trying to speed up the inevitable." Those were his exact words, Mom. Speed up the inevitable. I felt something break inside me at those words. My son thought our deaths were inevitable. Something to be scheduled at his convenience. We weren't people to him anymore. We were obstacles between him and money. "I told him he was dead to me," Laura said. "I told him I never wanted to see him again, and I meant it." She flew back to Oregon the next day. Before she left, she hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry you have to go through this." But she had nothing to be sorry for. Laura was everything a daughter should be. Kind, loyal, good. She was proof that we hadn't completely failed as parents. Jennifer moved in with her sister across town. She filed for divorce immediately. Brian tried to contest it, but his lawyer advised him to let it go. Fighting it would only make him look worse at his trial. She came to visit us once a week. We'd have tea, talk about ordinary things, try to reclaim some sense of normalcy. She was seeing a therapist, working through the trauma of everything that had happened. Thomas and I started seeing a therapist too. It helped, though nothing could truly heal the wound of knowing your child had tried to have you killed. The legal process moved slowly. There were hearings, motions, delays. Brian's lawyer tried to get the charges reduced, argued that Brian had never actually intended to go through with it, that it was all talk, but the evidence was overwhelming. The notebook, the text messages, the testimony from Kyle Brennan, and Jennifer's statement, detailed and damning. Finally, the trial was scheduled for February. I dreaded it. I didn't want to sit in a courtroom and listen to the details of how my son had planned to murder me. I didn't want to see him. Didn't want to hear his voice, but I knew I had to be there, had to face it, had to see it through to the end. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They showed the jury the notebook, read aloud Brian's handwritten notes about our routines, our schedules, our vulnerabilities. They showed the text messages between Brian and Kyle Brennan. "You still good for the job this weekend?" "Yeah." "Route 89, around mile marker 47, about 10:30 a.m., I'll be ready. Make it look natural. No signs of foul play. I know what I'm doing. You got my money? 5,000 now, 15 after." They brought in financial experts who showed that Brian was deeply in debt. Credit cards maxed out, car payments behind, mortgage payment late. He'd been desperate for money, Kyle Brennan testified. He was a rough-looking man in his 40s, tattoos visible on his neck and hands. He spoke clearly and without emotion, describing how Brian had approached him, what he'd been hired to do, how it was supposed to look like an accident. "He showed me pictures of his parents," Brennan said. "Pictures of their truck, told me their schedule. Said they'd be on Route 89 Saturday morning, that I should run them off the road at a spot where there was a steep embankment. Said to make it look like they lost control. He was real specific about it." "And you agreed to do this?" the prosecutor asked. "Yeah. He was paying good money. 20,000 total. I figured 2 old people, easy job, good payday. I didn't think about it beyond that." The defense tried to discredit Brennan, pointing out his criminal history, suggesting he was lying to get a reduced sentence. But his testimony matched all the other evidence too perfectly. Then Jennifer took the stand. She wore a simple blue dress and barely any makeup. She looked young and vulnerable and terrified. Her voice shook as she was sworn in. The prosecutor took her through her testimony gently. When did she first know about Brian's plan? What exactly did he tell her? How did she feel about it? Jennifer answered every question clearly, though tears ran down her face the entire time. "He told me his parents were old," she said, "that they didn't need the money, that they'd just waste it on medical bills eventually anyway. He said we deserved it because we were young, because we had our whole lives ahead of us." He made it sound so reasonable somehow, like it made sense, but I knew it was wrong. I knew it was evil. "Why didn't you go to the police immediately?" the prosecutor asked. "Because I was terrified. Because he threatened me. Because he's my husband and I loved him. And I kept thinking maybe he didn't really mean it. Maybe it was just talk. But then he showed me the money he'd paid Kyle. And I realized he was serious. That's when I knew I had to tell Karen and Thomas, no matter what it cost me." Brian's lawyer tried to shake her testimony on cross-examination, suggesting she was angry about their marriage problems, that she was making things up to hurt Brian. But Jennifer didn't waver. "I loved Brian," she said quietly. "I married him because I loved him, but I couldn't let him kill 2 innocent people, especially not Karen and Thomas. who have been nothing but kind to me. Finally, it was time for Thomas and me to testify. Thomas went first. He described our life together, our years of hard work and saving, our retirement plans. He described Brian's increasing interest in our finances, the questions that had made us uncomfortable but that we'd dismissed. Then he described that Saturday morning, the drive, my sudden terror, his decision to trust my instinct and turn around. If we hadn't turned back, he said, his voice thick with emotion, we'd be dead. Our son would have inherited our money and probably gotten away with murder. When it was my turn, I walked to the witness stand on shaking legs. I didn't look at Brian, couldn't bear to see him sitting at the defense table. I told my story about raising Brian, about loving him despite his faults, about trying to help him over the years, about the questions and the strange behavior that I'd tried to rationalize away, about the premonition that had saved our lives. I felt it in every cell of my body, I said, that we were in danger, that something terrible was going to happen if we kept going. I didn't know what it was or why I felt it, but I knew it was real. Do you still love your son? The prosecutor asked gently. I finally looked at Brian. He was staring at the table, his shoulders hunched, his face expressionless. I loved the child he was, I said, the little boy I raised, but that boy is gone. The man sitting there is someone I don't recognize, someone who valued money more than his parents' lives. So no, I don't love that man. Brian flinched at my words, but still didn't look up. Brian's lawyer put him on the stand in his own defense. It was a mistake. Brian tried to paint himself as a victim of circumstance, driven to desperation by financial problems. He claimed he'd never really intended to go through with it, that it was just fantasy, just venting. But the prosecutor tore him apart on cross-examination. You paid Kyle Brennan $5,000 for a fantasy? I wasn't thinking clearly. You wrote detailed notes about your parents' schedule for a fantasy? It got out of hand. You gave Kyle Brennan the exact time and location where your parents would be on the road for a fantasy? Brian had no answer for that. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was 2 weeks later. The judge was a severe-looking woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes. She looked at Brian with disgust as she spoke. Mr. Anderson, I have presided over many cases in my career, but few have disturbed me as much as this one. You plotted to murder your own parents. 2 people who gave you life, raised you, supported you, loved you, for money. Not because they abused you, not because they neglected you, simply because you wanted their retirement savings and didn't want to wait for nature to take its course. This was not a crime of passion or desperation. This was cold, calculated, premeditated murder for hire. You planned every detail. You hired a professional criminal. You paid him money, and you would have gone through with it if your wife hadn't found the courage to stop you. I can only imagine the pain you have caused your parents, your sister, your wife. You have destroyed your family. You have betrayed everyone who ever loved you. And for what? Money that wasn't even yours yet. I am sentencing you to 15 years in state prison on the conspiracy to commit murder charge, to run consecutively with 5 years on the solicitation of murder charge. 20 years total. And I hope you spend every day of those 20 years thinking about what you've done and the people you've hurt. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. 20 years. Brian finally looked at me then, his eyes wide with shock. He'd been expecting maybe 5 or 6 years, with possibility of parole, but 20 years meant he'd be nearly 50 when he got out, middle-aged. His youth gone, his life essentially over. I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no sadness, just emptiness. They led him away in handcuffs. And this time, I didn't look back. The months after the trial were strange. There was relief that it was over, that we could begin to move forward, but there was also grief, deep and profound, for the family we'd lost. Thomas and I tried to return to normal life, but normal didn't exist anymore. Everything was different now. Everything was tainted by what had happened. We'd been looking forward to retirement, to traveling, to enjoying the money we'd saved so carefully over the decades. But now, it all felt hollow. That money, that $800,000 that we'd worked so hard for, had nearly cost us our lives. It had turned our son into a would-be murderer. Sometimes I wished we'd never saved it, that we'd spent it as we earned it, lived beyond our means, died broke. Would Brian have loved us then? Would we still have been a family? But I knew that was irrational thinking. The money wasn't the problem. Brian was the problem. His greed, his entitlement, his willingness to value things over people, those were the issues. If it hadn't been our retirement savings, it would have been something else eventually. Jennifer continued to be a presence in our lives. She'd moved into her own apartment, was building a new life for herself. She dated occasionally but wasn't ready for anything serious. "I'm still learning to trust again," she told me, "to trust my own judgment. How did I not see what Brian was capable of? How did I marry someone who could plan murder? None of us saw it," I told her. "I'm his mother, and I didn't see it. Don't blame yourself." But she did blame herself, just as I blamed myself, just as Thomas blamed himself. We all wondered what we'd missed, what we could have done differently. Laura called every week, checking on us. She'd cut off all contact with Brian and refused to discuss him when we talked. "He's not my brother anymore," she said firmly. "I have no brother." It broke my heart that our family had been split this way, but I understood. Laura had her own family to protect, her own children to raise. She couldn't afford to have someone like Brian in their lives, even from prison. The community's reaction was mixed. Some people were supportive, bringing casseroles and offering prayers. Others seemed to think we must have done something to drive Brian to such desperation. There were whispers that we'd been too strict, or not strict enough, that we'd spoiled him, or neglected him, that we'd loved Laura more, that we'd been bad parents. Those whispers hurt more than I can say. One Sunday at church, about 6 months after the trial, a woman named Patricia Simmons cornered me in the fellowship hall. Patricia had always been a bit judgmental, but we'd been cordial to each other over the years. "Karen," she said, loud enough that others could hear, "I've been meaning to ask you something. How could you send your own son to prison? Don't you believe in forgiveness? The Bible says to forgive 70 times 7. I looked at her for a long moment. Everyone around us had gone quiet, watching to see how I'd respond. "Patricia," I said, keeping my voice calm, "my son planned to murder me and my husband. He paid someone money to run us off the road and make it look like an accident. If we hadn't turned back that day, we'd be dead, and he'd be spending our retirement money. So no, I don't forgive him. Not yet, maybe not ever. And if you think that makes me a bad Christian, then so be it." Patricia opened her mouth to respond, but I walked away. I heard murmuring behind me, but I didn't care. I was done apologizing for surviving, done apologizing for wanting justice. Thomas and I left that church shortly after and started attending a different one across town. The pastor there had heard our story and reached out to us personally, inviting us to visit. The congregation was smaller, more intimate, and no one judged us. It became a safe place for us. We did eventually take some trips, small ones at first, a long weekend at a bed and breakfast in the mountains, a week at the beach, testing the waters, making sure we could still enjoy life despite everything. Gradually, we began to heal. Not completely. I don't think you ever completely heal from something like this, but enough to function, to find moments of happiness, to remember that life was still worth living. One afternoon, about a year after Brian's sentencing, I was in the garden planting bulbs for spring when Thomas came out and sat beside me on the grass. "I got a letter from Brian," he said quietly, my hands stilled in the dirt. "What did it say?" "He wants us to visit him. Says he's been going to therapy in prison, working through things. Says he understands now how wrong he was. Says he's sorry." "Do you believe him?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. Part of me wants to. Part of me wants to believe that our son is still in there somewhere, that he can change, that he can become the person we always hoped he'd be. And the other part? The other part remembers him sitting in that courtroom showing no remorse. Remembers him testifying that he never really meant to go through with it, even though all the evidence said otherwise. Remembers him being angry instead of sorry. I pulled off my gardening gloves and took Thomas's hand. "We don't have to decide today. We can take our time. Think about it. Maybe talk to our therapist about it." He nodded. "What do you think you want to do?" I looked out over the garden, at the roses I'd planted 20 years ago that still bloomed faithfully every summer, at the vegetables growing in the raised beds Thomas had built for me, at our house that had sheltered us through 4 decades of marriage. "I don't know," I admitted. "He's my son. I carried him for 9 months. I nursed him, raised him, loved him. That doesn't just go away no matter what he's done. But I also know that the boy I loved is gone. The man who tried to have us killed is who he is now, and I don't know if I can face him. Don't know if I can sit across from him in a prison visiting room and pretend everything's okay." "We don't have to pretend anything," Thomas said. "If we go, and I'm not saying we should, we can be honest with him. Tell him how much he hurt us. Tell him what he destroyed. Would it make a difference? Would he hear us? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not, but at least we'd have tried." We sat there in the garden for a long time, holding hands, not speaking. Eventually, Thomas went back inside to start dinner, and I finished planting my bulbs. That night, I pulled out Brian's letter and read it for the first time. It was 3 pages long, handwritten on lined paper. His handwriting hadn't changed. Still the same messy scrawl he'd had since childhood. He wrote about prison life, about the therapy he was attending, about the books he'd been reading. He wrote about having time to think, to reflect on his choices. He said he understood now that what he'd done was evil, that there was no justification for it, that he'd let greed and resentment poison him. He said he was sorry. Over and over, he said he was sorry. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I destroyed our family and hurt you in ways that can never be repaired. I know that saying I'm sorry isn't enough, but I hope someday you'll be willing to see me, to talk to me, to let me try to explain. I'm your son. I'll always be your son. Even though I've done something unforgivable. I love you, Mom and Dad. I always have. Even when I was at my worst. I'm so sorry for everything." I folded the letter and put it away. Was he sincere? Had he really changed? Or was this just another manipulation, another attempt to get what he wanted? I didn't know, and I wasn't ready to find out, but I kept the letter, put it in a drawer in my bedside table. Because despite everything, despite the murder plot and the trial and the betrayal, there was still a tiny part of me that hoped, that wanted to believe my son could be redeemed. That tiny part was probably foolish, probably naive, but it was there, persistent and stubborn, refusing to completely let go. Maybe someday I'd be ready to visit him, to hear him out, to try to understand, but not yet, not yet. 2 years after Brian's conviction, Thomas and I finally took the trip we'd been planning when everything fell apart. We drove to Pineville to visit Margaret and Robert Carter, the friends we'd been on our way to see that Saturday morning when I'd had my premonition. They welcomed us with open arms, asked no intrusive questions, simply offered us their friendship and their home. We spent a wonderful weekend with them, eating good food, laughing at old stories, remembering better times. On Sunday morning, as Thomas and Robert worked on Robert's workshop project, Margaret and I sat on her back porch with coffee, watching birds at the feeders she'd set up around the yard. "How are you really doing?" she asked quietly. And I want the truth, not the polite answer. I considered the question carefully. Some days are good, some days are hard. I'm learning to live with what happened, but I don't think I'll ever fully make peace with it. "Have you seen Brian?" I shook my head. "He writes letters. Once a month or so. Thomas and I have talked about visiting him, but..." I trailed off. "You're not ready." "I don't know if I'll ever be ready." "How do you sit across from your child and talk to them like everything's normal when they tried to have you killed?" Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand. "You don't. You sit across from them and talk to them knowing that everything's changed, that nothing will ever be normal again, and you decide whether that conversation is worth having." "Is it?" I asked. "Worth having? Only you can answer that, honey. But I will say this. Holding on to anger and pain doesn't hurt Brian. He's in prison regardless of how you feel. But it does hurt you. It weighs you down, poisons your happiness. So whatever you decide, to see him or not to see him, to forgive him or not to forgive him, make sure you're doing it for you, not for him." Her words stayed with me long after we returned home. I thought about them as I tended my garden, as I cooked dinner, as I lay in bed at night. Was I holding on to anger? Or was I protecting myself from further hurt? Maybe both. 3 months later, I made a decision. I wrote Brian a letter. I didn't tell him I forgave him because I didn't. Not fully, maybe not ever, but I told him I was trying to understand, that I was working on letting go of the anger, that someday, maybe I might be ready to visit him. I told him about our trip to see the Carters, about the garden, about Whiskers the cat who'd gotten old and arthritic, but still demanded her daily petting. I told him about Laura and the kids, though I made it clear that Laura wanted no contact with him. I told him that what he'd done had broken something in our family that could never be fully repaired, but that I was learning to live with the brokenness, that I was finding happiness again, bit by bit. I told him I hoped he was using his time in prison to become a better person, not for our sake, but for his own, and I signed it. "Your mother, Karen." I mailed the letter before I could change my mind. 2 weeks later, I got a response. It was shorter than his usual letters, and I could tell he'd been crying when he wrote it. The ink was smudged in places, and the handwriting was even messier than usual. He thanked me for writing, said it meant more to him than I could know, said he was trying to be better, to understand the person he'd become and how to change. Said he didn't expect forgiveness, but was grateful I was willing to stay in contact. We began writing to each other regularly after that. Once a month, sometimes more. The letters were awkward at first, neither of us sure what to say, but gradually they became easier. I told him about ordinary things, the weather, the neighbors, what we'd had for dinner. He told me about prison life, the classes he was taking, the job he'd gotten in the prison library. We didn't talk about the murder plot, didn't rehash the trial or the hurt or the betrayal. Those things hung between us, unspoken but acknowledged. After 6 months of letters, Thomas and I decided to visit him. The prison was a 3-hour drive, a grim concrete building surrounded by high fences topped with razor wire. We had to go through multiple security checkpoints, empty our pockets, walk through metal detectors. The visiting room was institutional and depressing. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor, vending machines along one wall, guards watching everything. And then Brian walked in. He looked older, he'd lost weight, and there were lines on his face that hadn't been there before. His hair was cut short, and he wore a blue prison uniform. He moved carefully, almost timidly, as if he expected us to run away. When he sat down across from us, he looked at each of us in turn, his eyes filling with tears. "Mom, Dad, thank you for coming. Thank you so much." We talked for an hour. It was awkward and painful and necessary. Brian cried. I cried. Thomas sat stoic and silent for most of it, just listening. Brian didn't make excuses for what he'd done, didn't try to explain it away or minimize it. He simply said, over and over, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." When our time was up and we had to leave, Brian stood and looked at us with an expression of desperate hope. "Will you come back, please? I understand if you don't want to, but we'll come back," I heard myself say. "Not next month. Maybe not the month after, but we'll come back." The relief on his face was almost painful to see. On the drive home, Thomas and I didn't talk much. We were both processing what had just happened, what it meant, where we went from here. Finally, as we pulled into our driveway, Thomas said, "That was harder than I expected." "Yeah," I agreed. "It was. Do you regret going?" I thought about that. No. I needed to see him, to hear him say he was sorry while looking me in the eye. I needed to know if he meant it. And do you think he did? Mean it? I think so. But I also think it doesn't matter as much as I thought it would. Whether he's sorry or not doesn't change what happened, doesn't undo the hurt, doesn't give us back what we lost. Thomas nodded slowly. "So why did we go?" "Because he's our son. And maybe because we needed closure, to see that he's paying for what he did, to know that he's facing the consequences." We did visit Brian again, about 3 months later, and then again 3 months after that. The visits became a regular thing. Though we never went more often than once every few months, it was all we could handle emotionally. Slowly, very slowly, we began to rebuild some kind of relationship with him. It would never be what it was. Could never be. Too much had been broken. Too much trust destroyed. But it was something, a thread of connection between parent and child, frayed and damaged, but still there. Laura never forgave Brian. She refused to visit him, refused to write to him, refused even to speak his name. I understood. She had to protect herself and her family in her own way, just as Thomas and I were doing in ours. Jennifer moved on with her life. She eventually met someone new, a kind man named David who worked as an accountant. They got married in a small ceremony that Thomas and I attended. She was radiant, genuinely happy in a way I'd never seen her with Brian. It gave me hope that good things could still happen, that people could heal and find happiness even after terrible trauma. As for Thomas and me, we learned to live with what had happened. The fear, the betrayal, the grief, they became part of our story, part of who we were, but they didn't define us. We refused to let them. We took the trips we'd planned, saw the Grand Canyon, visited Yellowstone, even took a cruise to Alaska. We used our retirement savings to do the things we'd dreamed of doing, and we didn't feel guilty about it. That money had almost cost us our lives, but we'd survived. We'd earned the right to enjoy it. We sold our house. There were too many memories there, too many ghosts, and bought a smaller place in a different neighborhood, a fresh start. We made new friends, joined new clubs, created new routines. Life went on. It had to. People sometimes ask me if I've forgiven Brian. It's a complicated question with no simple answer. I've forgiven him for being human, for having flaws, for making mistakes. I've forgiven him in the sense that I no longer actively wish him harm or spend my days consumed with anger. But have I forgiven him for planning to murder us, for valuing money over our lives, for being willing to make us disappear so he could inherit our savings? I don't know. Maybe I never will. And I've made peace with that uncertainty. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip, a box you check off, and then you're done. It's a process. Messy and complicated and ongoing. Some days I feel more forgiving than others. Some days I'm angry all over again. Some days I just feel sad. But I'm learning that I don't have to have it all figured out. I don't have to reach some perfect state of grace where I've completely forgiven and forgotten. I just have to keep living, keep moving forward, keep choosing life and love and hope over bitterness and anger and despair. 5 years after Brian's conviction, Thomas and I were sitting on our back porch on a warm summer evening. We'd just finished dinner, grilled chicken and vegetables from our garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Thomas reached over and took my hand. "You ever think about that day?" he asked. "The day you told me to turn the car around." "Sometimes," I admitted. "More than sometimes, actually." "Do you think it was really a premonition? Some kind of sixth sense?" I'd asked myself that question countless times over the years. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was intuition picking up on things I'd noticed subconsciously about Brian's behavior. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was divine intervention. I don't think I'll ever know for sure. But it saved our lives. Yes, it did. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky darken and the stars begin to appear. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of roses and honeysuckle. "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Turning him in? Having him arrested?" I didn't have to think about my answer. No, never. He planned to kill us, Thomas. If we hadn't stopped him, we'd be dead, and he'd probably have gotten away with it. Our deaths would have been ruled an accident, and he'd be living in our house, spending our money, and no one would know the truth. Do you think he'd have felt guilty? Maybe. Maybe not. I'd like to think some part of him would have regretted it. But honestly, I think he'd have convinced himself it was justified, that we were old anyway, that we'd lived our lives, that he deserved the money more than we did. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I used to wonder where we went wrong, what we did to make him turn out that way. And now I think we did the best we could. We loved him, provided for him, taught him right from wrong. But at some point, he made his own choices, and those choices weren't our fault. No, I agreed. They weren't. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Thomas said, "I'm glad you told me to turn around that day." I squeezed his hand. "Me too. I'm glad we got more time together. These past 5 years, they've been good years, despite everything." "They have," I said, and I meant it. Despite the trauma, despite the grief, despite the betrayal, we'd found happiness again. We'd built a new life, made new memories, discovered that joy was still possible even after terrible pain. "I love you, Karen," Thomas said. "I've loved you since the day we met, and I'll love you till the day I die." "I love you too," I told him. "Always." We sat there until full dark, holding hands, watching the stars emerge one by one in the summer sky, at peace. Not because everything was perfect, or because all our wounds had healed, but because we'd survived. We'd faced the worst thing we could imagine, betrayal by our own child, and we'd come through it. Scarred? Yes. Changed? Absolutely. But still here, still together, still choosing life. And that, I've learned, is enough. Brian will be eligible for parole in another 13 years. He'll be in his 50s by then. No longer the young man who thought he could get rich quick by murdering his parents. Whether we'll have any kind of relationship with him when he gets out, I don't know. That's a bridge we'll cross when we come to it. Laura continues to thrive in Oregon. Her kids are teenagers now, doing well in school, involved in sports and music. She's been promoted at work and is talking about going back to school for her master's degree. She's happy, healthy, whole. And she's made it clear that when Brian gets out of prison, she wants nothing to do with him. We respect her decision. Jennifer and David had a baby last year, a little girl they named Grace. They asked Thomas and me to be godparents, and we said yes. Holding that baby, seeing the joy on Jennifer's face, knowing that she'd found happiness after such darkness, it gave me hope for the future. As for me, I'm 69 years old now. I've retired from nursing. Thomas is fully retired from construction work, and we spend our days doing exactly what we want: gardening, reading, traveling, spending time with friends and family. Simple pleasures, but profound ones. I've learned a lot over these past 5 years. I've learned that family is complicated, that love isn't always enough, that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most can hurt you the deepest. But I've also learned that survival is possible, that healing, while never complete, is real, that you can build a good life even after terrible trauma. I've learned to trust my instincts, to listen to that inner voice that warns of danger. I've learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is face an ugly truth, even when it's about someone you love. I've learned that forgiveness is a process, not an event, that it's okay to still be working through it, to not have all the answers. And I've learned that life is precious, that every day is a gift, that the time we have with the people we love should never be taken for granted. That morning on the highway, when I felt that overwhelming terror and begged Thomas to turn around, I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't know why I felt what I felt or what we were turning back from, but I trusted it, and that trust saved our lives. Looking back, I see that moment as a turning point, not just because it prevented our deaths, but because it taught me to trust myself, to know that my feelings, my instincts, my inner knowing, they're valid, they matter, they can be trusted. So many women, especially women of my generation, were taught to doubt themselves, to defer to others, to ignore their instincts in favor of logic or social expectations. But our instincts exist for a reason. They're the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of evolution, the survival mechanisms that kept our ancestors alive. And sometimes, when we're in danger, those instincts speak to us in ways we can't fully explain or rationalize. That's what happened to me that day. Some deep, primal part of my brain knew we were in danger, knew that if we kept going, we'd die, and it screamed at me until I paid attention. I'm grateful I listened. Last week, I was working in the garden when a young woman stopped on the sidewalk and called out to me. "Excuse me? Are you Karen Anderson?" I straightened up, wiping dirt from my hands. "Yes, I am." She walked up to the garden fence, a nervous smile on her face. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm a journalism student at the university. I'm doing a project on intuition and women's safety. And I heard about your story, about how you had a premonition that saved your life. Would you be willing to talk to me about it?" I hesitated. We'd mostly avoided media attention after the trial. The story had been sensationalized enough without us contributing to it, but something in this young woman's earnest face made me reconsider. "What do you want to know? How did you know you were in danger? What did it feel like? And do you think other women should trust their instincts the way you did?" I invited her in for tea, and we talked for over an hour. I told her my story. Not all of it. Not the painful personal details, but the core of it, the premonition, the decision to turn back, the discovery of what we'd escaped. And I told her yes, absolutely, women should trust their instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If you feel afraid, there's probably a reason. Don't let anyone, not a friend, not a partner, not a family member, not society, talk you out of trusting your own inner knowing. "But what if you're wrong?" she asked. "What if there's no real danger and you're just being paranoid?" "Then you're wrong," I said simply. "And maybe you feel a little foolish, but you're alive and safe. Whereas if you ignore your instincts and you're right to be afraid, well, you might not get a second chance." She nodded thoughtfully, taking notes. Before she left, she asked one more question. "Do you have any regrets about how you handled things with your son?" I thought carefully before answering. "I regret that it happened at all. I regret that my son became someone capable of planning murder. I regret the family we lost, the trust that was broken, the innocence we can never get back. But do I regret turning him in? Pressing charges? Making sure he faced consequences? No, never, because the alternative was letting him get away with attempted murder, and I couldn't live with that." After she left, I went back to my garden. The sun was warm on my face. Birds were singing in the trees, and everything smelled green and alive. I thought about that young journalism student, about all the young women out there trying to navigate a world that often tells them to be nice, be accommodating. Don't make a fuss, don't be paranoid. And I hoped my story might help even one of them trust herself when it mattered most. Tonight, as I write this, Thomas is asleep in our bedroom. I can hear him snoring softly. A comforting sound that reminds me he's here, he's real, we're both alive. Tomorrow we're driving up to see Laura and the kids. They're having a birthday party for Emma, who's turning 16. We'll bring presents and eat cake and laugh and make memories. Normal family things. Next month we'll visit Brian. It'll be awkward and sad and necessary. We'll sit across from him in that depressing visiting room and make small talk and try to find some connection to the boy we used to know. And then we'll drive home and be grateful for our freedom, for our life, for each other. This is my reality now, a complicated mix of joy and sorrow, healing and hurt, love and loss. But it's my life, Thomas's and mine. We're living it on our terms, making our own choices, finding our own way through the darkness. That premonition 5 years ago changed everything. It saved our lives, yes, but it also taught me that I'm stronger than I thought, that I can survive things I never imagined surviving, that I can face horrible truths and keep going, that I can love and grieve and heal all at the same time. I'm 69 years old, and I'm not done yet, not by a long shot. I still have gardens to plant and grandchildren to spoil and trips to take and books to read and sunsets to watch with the man I love. I still have a life to live, and I'm going to live it fully, gratefully, courageously. Because that morning 5 years ago, I listened to my instincts. I trusted myself. I turned the car around, and that decision saved everything. This is my story. It's not a happy story, not entirely, but it's a true one. A story about intuition and survival, about betrayal and resilience, about the complicated nature of family and love and forgiveness. It's a story about choosing life, even when life is hard, and it's a story I'm grateful to be alive to tell. 10 years after that fateful Saturday morning, Thomas and I celebrated our 52nd wedding anniversary. We took a cruise through the Mediterranean, something we'd always dreamed of doing. We visited Greece and Italy and Spain, ate incredible food, saw ancient ruins, watched sunsets over the sea. One evening, standing on the deck of the ship with Thomas's arm around me, I found myself thinking about all the years we almost didn't have. If I hadn't listened to that premonition, if Thomas hadn't trusted me enough to turn around, we'd have missed all of this. These 10 years of travel and grandchildren and quiet mornings and laughter and love. Brian was released from prison last year after serving 15 years of his 20-year sentence. He got out early for good behavior. He lives in another state now, working at a warehouse, trying to rebuild his life. We talk on the phone occasionally. The conversations are still awkward, still loaded with unspoken pain. He's apologized countless times. He's in therapy, working on himself, trying to understand who he was and who he wants to be. I believe he's genuine in his remorse, but I also know that some things can never be fully repaired. Laura still won't see him, won't talk to him. That's her choice, and we respect it. Jennifer and David have 3 children now. Their lives are full and happy. We see them several times a year, and it brings me joy to see how well Jennifer is doing, how she built a beautiful life out of the ashes of her trauma. As for me, I'm 74 years old now. My hair is completely gray. My hands are gnarled with arthritis. My body moves more slowly than it used to. But I'm here. I'm alive. And I'm grateful for every single day. That premonition, that inexplicable terror that made me beg Thomas to turn the car around. It was the most important moment of my life. Not because I understand it any better now than I did then. I still don't know if it was intuition, or divine intervention, or some kind of subconscious processing of warning signs I'd noticed about Brian's behavior. But it doesn't matter what it was. What matters is that I listened to it. I trusted it, and it saved my life. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this: trust yourself. Trust your instincts. Trust that inner voice that warns you of danger. It might save your life too. My name is Karen Anderson, and this is the story of the premonition that saved my life, revealed my son's dark secret, and taught me that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. Thank you for listening.